Heather Teysko, and I'm also the host of the Renaissance English History podcast, which has been running since 2009. And Jonathan, my co-host, and I recorded this episode when we were apart via Skype. So we're going to jump right into the questions here in a second, but I just want to do the regular disclaimer that if you're listening to this, we are assuming that you are watching the Tudors. There's spoilers, so spoiler alert. Don't watch this if you don't want to know what happened in each episode. And then also even longer term, we talk about things that happen like Anne Boleyn gets killed. So don't listen to this if you don't want to watch or if you don't want to know what's going to happen in the future and you don't know and you want to keep it that way. And so the other thing, if you want to learn more about us, more about my other show, about the Renaissance English History podcast, you can go to watchingthetudors.com. And there's also a Facebook page, facebook.com/watchingthetudors. Finally, one great thing you can do to help us if you want to help support this show is to leave us a rating or a review on iTunes. It is the number one thing you can do to help shows rise in the ratings so more people can find us and more people can listen to us. So please leave us a review on iTunes if you can, or even just a rating. Just click 5 stars, please. So the quick kind of episode, what happens in the episode is that Cardinal Campeggio gets to London and, there's all this work behind the scenes of trying to have this divorce happen. And the real piece of drama, as it were, is that they're trying to convince Catherine of Aragon that if she just goes into a nunnery, she won't have to worry about this, which would be true. It would also have a lot of other things happen. But so the main thing is trying to force Catherine into a nunnery and just the delays that are going on with trying to get this divorce. So we will jump right into the questions.
So the episode starts off with a painter painting the king and queen sitting next to each other. And I guess my questions are first, is that something that kings and queens would do? Or, people like royalty or something just sit to have their paintings painted? And also, was the actual painting that they were sitting for and having done, is that a real painting?
Cool. Yeah. So I don't think that was actually a real painting, but yes, people did do that. And what would usually happen is that people would take sketches and then they would paint from their sketches. But the act of taking sketches could, take hours for people to get all the different, angles that they wanted so that they could recreate a lifelike painting. And interestingly, so the Tudors were brilliant at propaganda through art. Just absolutely amazing at it. And any people who are advertising people into, branding could totally take a lesson from the Tudors. Henry VIII especially, and then Elizabeth mastered the art of the portrait to show a message. And I actually did an episode on this on the other podcast, Portraits and Propaganda. And I looked at some of the really famous paintings of Henry and what he was trying to say in them. And a really big thing of this was if you look at each painting of him and when it was actually done, there's a very famous painting of him that dates from right after Anne had been put to death. And of course, spoiler alert, she's put to death in part on charges of adultery. Now, adultery was a really embarrassing thing for men at the time. It was bad for the women, of course, too, but it was really embarrassing for men because the thought process was if your woman was going to cheat on you, then you clearly couldn't please her. And so in this really famous portrait of Henry from 1537, he has the most enormous codpiece ever. It's scary. And that was basically him saying, yeah, look, it's all Anne's fault because look at this codpiece, right? just check it out. Like, of course I can please her. And it's really, really funny to like, when you look at these paintings, at these portraits and when they were done and like this sort of subliminal messages that they were sending at the time. And so I think it's interesting that they included that. I don't know that they meant to include that as a message about the Tudors and their portraits and their propaganda, but it made me think about that the Tudors were just masterful at that. And one interesting note even further down the line with Elizabeth, as Elizabeth was getting old, she didn't want people to paint her old. She always wanted to keep this, the very famous images that we have of Elizabeth, of Gloriana, and she never seems to age. And in part, she put out authorized sketches that you had to paint her portrait from those authorized sketches. And if you deviated from them, you would lose your rights to painting her portrait. And so that's just kind of a note on painting and portraits in general. So the short answer is I don't think that particular painting was done. I really don't think it was. I could tell you it wasn't. But yes, people did sit for portraits like that, and it could take hours.
I see. All right. Next, Campeggio, the cardinal sent from the Pope, came to visit Wolsey, and they were talking like they knew each other. Like, did they know each other before this?
They probably would have known each other professionally, like work contacts.
I see. So kind of known of each other, known each other a little. They didn't like grow up together or something.
No.
And also Campeggio knew like all about Anne. Like, was she not necessarily like her, but I mean, was this whole situation like known about everywhere? I mean, it wasn't like a secret.
Yeah, everybody knew.
So everyone knew. All right. And then the king, the next scene, the king was walking with Anne in the gardens or something, and they were talking about their wedding and stuff like that. Do you think the king was really like, he was just totally sure this was going to happen? I mean, there was no it just seems like there's no question in his head.
No,
it just seems strange.
Well, I think you have to remember also that the idea of getting an annulment, of having your marriage annulled when you were royal wasn't anything new. For Henry, this was just a basic, no big deal. Like, just send in the paperwork. Like, this had been done before. It had just been done in France. Louis XII had gotten rid of his wife. They even brought her up when they were talking about the idea of sending Catherine to a convent, that Louis XII's wife had done this. I mean, this wasn't a new thing. And especially if your wife couldn't bear you a child, that was like the Queen's number one job, was to bear a child. And so if you couldn't do that, it was really standard procedure in a lot of ways. And especially then if the king had somebody else, like, he had no reason to think that this wasn't going to be accepted. And, he had been on the empire. He had no reason to believe that this wasn't going to be accepted.
So the whole problem was just that the Pope had to give him permission in the first place.
And not only that, and I mean, again, he would have, under normal circumstances, the Pope would have been like, okay, cool, I'll sign it, no big deal. But because Charles V was Catherine's nephew, and because he had custody of the Pope's body and, had Rome.
I see.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so that has something to do with it too.
Yeah.
And then they were also talking about the Queen, not them two, but then the next scene was the cardinals and stuff again. And they were talking about the Queen abdicating her marriage. Like, they were going to go talk her into this. And so I guess it was Campeggio that went to talk to the Queen and talk her into it. And I mean, is that like a real thing? I mean, they really proposed this to the Queen, Catherine?
Yes. And to be honest, it would have been a really elegant solution, and it was a solution that had been done in France just a generation before. There was precedent for that, and I think that if Catherine hadn't been Ferdinand and Isabella's daughter, I think many people would have realized, okay, I can't give him the son that he needs. And, it sucks for me, but, here's this great life. And especially, she was very religious. She was very devout. To them, it probably seemed like a really fine idea.
Yeah, no, I get it. I can see how that'd be, kind of a win on everyone's part. I mean, aside from the Queen, like going against how she feels, but yeah. And I wrote, I'm proud of her. I'm proud of the Queen. She's pretty awesome for sticking to her wits or whatever.
So one other thing I want to say about that is that she was also thinking about her daughter Mary's rights. So if she would have abdicated and then, if Henry would have had children with Anne, they would have had precedent over Mary. And so she was thinking not just about herself, but about her daughter and her daughter's right to rule. Now, in England, the idea of a female monarch by herself was an anathema. I think we talked about it before, that the last time England had something like that happen was like the granddaughter of William the Conqueror was Matilda, and there was a huge civil war around it. And, England had just come out of the Wars of the Roses, and England didn't want to have to, come to grips with the idea of a female monarch. But of course, for Catherine, her mother was a female monarch on her own who was a warrior queen, right? So for Catherine, it's like, well, what's the big deal? Of course a woman can do this. Like, who cares? But for England, it was much different. And so Catherine was really trying to protect Mary's interest as well by not abdicating. It wasn't even so much her being stubborn. There was probably some of that, but it was also her protecting her family.
I see. Yeah. So there was more to it than just this doesn't feel right kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. Next scene, we had Cromwell go and visit Anne at her house. And I was just really kind of confused at this. I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't that confusing if you know more. I was just really confused. He's talking about a guy, Cardinal Fish or something, who was in Holland, who wrote something about the Pope. I really didn't kind of understand it.
Yeah. So there was a guy called Simon Fish, and he really did exist. He was a reformer, a Protestant, and he actually, at the time, William Tyndale was spreading the English version of the New Testament, and this was all going on in Holland, in the Netherlands. And Simon Fish helped to spread that, and he wrote a lot, and he was a very prominent reformer. Now, I don't know that Cromwell knew Fish. I don't know that they would have talked, but I think that this scene is alluding to the fact that Cromwell was a Protestant. Even at this point, he was very anti-Catholic, and I think it's foreshadowing. Cromwell is responsible for the dissolution of the monasteries, like totally, and we're going to see that further on. So it's probably hinting at that, and it's also hinting at this idea that Anne also had likely had some reformist leanings. I don't know that she was a full-out Protestant, but she definitely leaned to that direction. And that would ultimately be, what the arguments that Henry used to throw off papal authority were going to be from these reformers. And so I think it's just kind of starting to hint at that. So there was indeed a doctor, or a Simon Fish, and Cromwell was a Protestant, and I don't know that this scene would have happened with him handing this to Anne, especially this early on, but that's what was kind of going on with that.
Yeah. I understand. It kind of paints the picture of, to me, I without this, I wouldn't have known that there was like this, I don't know, Protestant movement where, there's people writing things all over the place in different countries. So it makes sense now. And then next, we see Thomas Tallis with his new love interest, and they can both see the girl Jane's dead sister, which is just more strangeness.
I don't even understand. I'm so angry at this storyline around Thomas Tallis. Like, yeah.
Like, it's just, I can just imagine the writers, like, sitting around before starting it, like, hey, so let's make the Thomas Tallis a really strange one who is interested, has love interests in men and women and their sisters and all sorts of people, and he can see ghosts, and he's odd. So yeah, it's like.
The other thing is, so the other part of this that makes me angry is that Thomas Tallis wasn't at court at this time. This is predating him. So I don't know why you've got to bring him in here when at the time there are actually really interesting stories around music. If you want to bring music into the time period, like there was this guy, Petrarch Alamire, and he was, he was the guy who was he was actually a double agent, but he was a musician and he had a big studio where he would write manuscripts and copy manuscripts and stuff like that. And there's actually an album that the group Alamire, named after him, did called The Spy's Choir Book. And it's basically, he was like a double agent and he was spying for Henry on the continent and he was spying for the continent on Henry. And he was like this double agent who was also a musician. And the thing at the time period is that musicians were often the biggest spies because they could go around from place to place to place to place and like nobody suspected them because they were just traveling around composing their music, playing their music, and like they got all this patronage at court. And so they made really good spies. And, you know, Alamire is an example of a spy that we know about. So I don't really know. There's like all these really great stories around the music of the time period. If you want to like get into making a weird story, why do you have to invent Thomas Tallis seeing ghosts? I don't understand that. Like do a storyline with Alamire. Like that would make so much more sense to me.
Yeah, and then just have Thomas Tallis come in to the court when he actually came into the court, maybe. Like crazy. All right, so moving on. Oh, no, there was a question in all of that. Did Thomas Tallis actually marry a lady named Jane?
I think it was Joan, and yes, he did.
Okay, Joan. All right. Catherine talks to Cardinal Campeggio. Did she actually talk to him?
Yes.
All right. And then next, Charles Brandon, I think his name is, and the king's come back to court as you said they were earlier. And I just wanted to make a note because I was slightly confused last episode because of the weird Brandon sex scene that seemed to have like no point. Well, it made sense this time because now they're arguing about how Brandon had all these mistresses. And if we wouldn't have had that scene, we would have been like, what are you talking about? I understand the random sex scene with Brandon from last episode.
There you go.
And then the next scene, they're all dancing, like they're having a little party or whatever they call it in the court or whatever. And it's not a question, just a statement. Like, it seems so awkward. Like Henry with Anne, just like in public, and like he's like on the international scene with this girl, and he's like married. I mean, it just seems so, is uncouth the right word? It's just so like unbecoming of a king.
Well, yes. And it was also fairly common for kings to have their mistresses. In France, for example, later on, the king had his number one mistress who like lived with the wife, and they were all kind of one happy family, as it were. So while to our eyes, it might look very strange, and I think it was kind of uncomfortable. I think Henry at this point still saw it as like, this is my number one mistress, and that's who that is. And Catherine kind of thought, well, I have to accept it. And I think they were both aware that there could be a lot more going on here. I don't think queens particularly liked their husbands having mistresses, but especially once they were past childbearing age and when they were pregnant. And, there were so many times when the church told you that you weren't allowed to have sex. Like, seriously, like you weren't allowed to have sex on Fridays. You weren't allowed to have sex on feast days. You weren't allowed to have sex like during Lent. You weren't allowed to have sex during Advent. You weren't like the idea that anybody could get pregnant, like, with all of the times that you weren't allowed to have sex, like, it kind of blows me away. I mean, clearly people weren't following this, but in theory. And so, again, like when queens were pregnant, you weren't allowed to have sex with them. And so it was really common for the kings to partake of mistresses, and the queens just were kind of like, all right, well, I'm the queen. That's a mistress, whatever. But, and even at court, like they would potentially bring the mistresses to court, and people would know, like, okay, that's his mistress, so I need to get in good with her if, you know, because she has his ear and blah, 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 blah. And so I don't think it was particularly that unusual. What was unusual in this was that the idea that there actually could be two queens coming up, that Henry really wanted to leave Catherine. And I think that made it extra strange.
I was just a little thing. I'm still not into the dancing, but maybe I'll come around to it by the end of the show.
I love it. I think it's so hot.
You know, I don't get it.
It's like all that anticipation and all of this, like, you know, these scripted movements. Like, I don't know. I think it's hot.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy it.
I do.
So the next scene is not as poetic, I guess. It's like the crazy guys in purple. I'm not sure who, like, they're her, kind of like her legal representation, but they're from the church as well. But anyways, they're like her purple holy lawyers or something. And they come in and I just can't believe. I mean, I can believe it. Like, you know, I know how things go with politicians and royalty, but just that these guys would have the nerve, like, being sworn to God, to come in and, like, you know, say this stuff that they know are just outright lies, like, to Catherine, and, like, pressuring her into, like, doing things when she knows it's not true. Like, it was just a really kind of hard to believe scene or whatever. And I'm just really proud of her for being such a proud woman and not being like, oh yes, you're right, I'm just a weak woman and whatever you say must be true. And I don't know. I'm glad she sent them out of there.
Yep. Well, she was Spanish.
Yes, I like it. The Spanish women really, you know, I'm here in Spain, so I can I was just thinking about this yesterday, watching this lady drive. Like, Spanish women seem to be very strong women, like, just strong women. I think it's pretty awesome. Anyways, next Henry went into her bed, like, spent the night with Anne for whatever weird reason. I guess this is just a question not of history or anything. This is a question of a man asking a woman, because I don't know how you women think even still. Was that, like, polite of him to, like, share her bed because she would want to share her bed, or, like, completely insulting because they both know, like, he's in love with someone else, or is it kind of both? Like,
well, I think Catherine knew what was going on. You know, she knew that he had to do this for the sake of appearance, and probably part of her thought, you know, maybe I can convince him now that he's here and he's away. And so, yeah, you know, until her dying day, Catherine never blamed Henry for this. Catherine always loved Henry, and she always blamed his advisors and Anne. And, you know, I think that she thought if she could just talk to him, like, and remind him of how much they meant to each other, and, you know, try to remind him of all of this, she would be able to win him back. Now she miscalculated how much Henry wanted this divorce, but, you know, I think that at times like this, she would have seen this as an opportunity to remind him of why he married her, I suppose, and to try to bring him back. She continually prayed for his soul and thought that his soul was in peril because he was listening to these horrible advisors and things like that.
And he was so cold to her, like, just, you know, she's, like, pouring out her heart, and he's saying, like, maybe I should just send you and your daughter away, and blah, blah, blah. And just, is there a record, like, I mean, not like transcripts, but I mean, did we, like, was he really that cold to her? Like,
yeah, he was.
Not cool, man. Then we're back with Thomas Tallis. He's having intimate time with his lady. And I guess he was talking about traveling. And I guess I was just, you know, my history isn't the greatest. By this time, what are we, around like 1520s or?
Late 1520s, yeah.
Okay, late 15. Like, was most of the world discovered? I mean, America, 1492 is like that all? I mean, he was talking about China and...
Yeah.
I mean, I guess they knew about all this by that time about...
Well, they would have known about China anyway, because of the land routes at the time. But and Marco Polo and all that, they knew that there was a China for a long time. And that was the whole idea of trying to get there by going to the west rather than the east. But no, Magellan, who was, of course, the first person to sail around, to cross the Pacific Ocean and sail around the world, he was in 1519 to 1521. So
theoretically, we, the humans, knew the world was round by this point.
Yeah, well, we knew it was round with Columbus then, I think. And that was the whole idea behind Columbus, was that you could sail to the west to get to the east because the world was round. So that was the proposition. But yeah, by this point, we knew for sure. We knew that there was this huge Pacific Ocean, how to cross it, all that, and then how Africa went. And we kind of then had the charts to see kind of how big it was and to know all of that. Yeah.
I see. Can I ask a side question?
Sure.
When was it that, who was it? Was it Galileo that was, they were threatening to kill him because he said the world was round?
No, he said that the world was the center, he was heliocentric versus, yeah.
Do you know when that was?
That was the 17th century, mid-17th century.
Oh, so that was after this happened.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Oh, God, so we still... It's just amazing to me, how the information kind of trickles in. But anyways, that's a whole different story. Thank you for...
Yeah, so that was...
we could talk about that.
I think by this point, people who knew, who could follow this stuff knew that the Earth went around the sun rather than the other way around. But it wasn't officially proven, and it was people like Galileo who were writing about it and stuff like that, yeah.
So anyways, back to this. It seems as if it's all coming together with Anne and her mission to get Wolsey out, because it's all falling down for Wolsey. Because the next scene was when Wolsey was walking around with the king, and the king, Anne told Henry that it was Wolsey that's stalling this all up, and then so the king has a word with Wolsey, and Wolsey's begging him no, please, I'm your servant, and it's just kind of all coming together. This is the beginning of the end of Wolsey, is it not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. It seems like it. It used to seem like the king was hey, what do we do, Wolsey, this and that. Now it's what are you doing wrong, Wolsey? And, I don't believe you. And it's just the tone has changed.
Yeah. I think Henry was really loyal up until the point where he started suspecting you, and then it all went downhill very quickly.
And Anne sure seemed to have control of his mind. It seemed before the king was being led around by Wolsey, and now it's he's being led around by Anne, and he just seems so immature. He's this 5-year-old boy playing king, and he has no idea what he's doing in life. Anyways,
there's a lot of psychiatry from 500 years removed on Henry.
Maybe I could write a book one day on Henry, because that's how into it I am. Just kidding. Cromwell seems to be stepping in. Did Cromwell kind of just assume Wolsey's spot once he lose? I mean, not this is happening this episode, but it seems Cromwell's coming in to fill the soon vacant seat of Wolsey.
Yes.
Is that something accurate?
Yeah, well, Cromwell was always very loyal to Wolsey, and Cromwell would remain loyal to Wolsey, even though they may have disagreed on religious. On religious issues. They were basically the same kind of men. They both had very humble beginnings, and they both rose through smarts and through street smarts, and through being able to get stuff done. And Cromwell really admired Wolsey. Wolsey really admired Cromwell. Wolsey was the one who kept promoting Cromwell, and Cromwell was very loyal to Wolsey. And Cromwell would, I don't think, and that's the whole series Wolf Hall is all about, Cromwell basically never forgiving the people who led to Wolsey's downfall. And at the same time, Cromwell was loyal to Cromwell. And as he started to be able to see the writing on the wall, I think he thought, okay, well, there's a position for me. And also there's a position for me as the cardinal's man. It's almost like keeping the cardinal's legacy going. Like, you know, I'm loyal to the cardinal, and, you know, if I step into his shoes, at least it's kind of like I'm his protege, and, you know, keeping his, and it's good for him too. So I think there were a number of things, but he was very loyal to Wolsey. It's not like he was trying to, I don't think at this point he would have been trying to undercut him or be disloyal or anything like that. But he also could see what was coming, and he knew he had to look out for himself too.
That makes sense. Yeah. And he had like, it's so fascinating how it all works together. Because he's a Protestant, but he's, you know, in favor of Wolsey. It's all interesting. So the king asked Charles Brandon to run an errand kind of thing for him, to go to France with the French king. Is that something someone like Brandon would have done?
Yes.
Like sort of do things for the king? Like the king would have people like him do things like this for him?
Yeah, and I don't know, you know, I don't think he sent Brandon to France directly. But, you know, little errands like this, yeah, if you were Henry's super trusted person, he would send you over a diplomat, if it was something really that he really wanted to trust you with.
I see. Next, we have Bishop Fisher, speaking with, Catherine.
Yes.
And who is Bishop Fisher? Who's this guy?
So he was actually Margaret Beaufort's confessor, and Lady Margaret Beaufort is Henry VIII's grandmother on his father's side. It was his father, Henry VII, Henry Tudor. It was his mother. And Bishop Fisher was her confessor, was her priest. He was loyal to her, and, you know, they had a very good relationship and were very, very close. Now, by this point, he's very old, and he was very conservative and very much, you know, against the marriage to Anne, and that's who he was. All
right. Then next we had the French king speaking with Charles Brandon. And I thought the French king had good advice. You know, Brandon was poking for information for everyone, and Wolsey, and just the French king kind of said, you know, I think the king needs to handle this himself, basically, and quit relying on other people. And yeah, I guess there's no real question there. I thought that was pretty sound. And it's kind of what ends up happening in a way, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's that. Next, Wolsey goes to Campeggio's house and kind of like roughs him up a little. And then like he attacks some other guy. Like, I mean, I guess this is just wild speculation, but do you think like Wolsey was like at this point, like seriously like attacking people just because he knew like his life was in danger with this? Or
I don't think it would have been that. I don't think it would have been that unusual, because Wolsey did come, you know, kind of like off the streets, and like he had this kind of rough side to him, being the son of a butcher kind of thing. And so I think he would have known how to rough people up if he needed to. I don't know that it would have been particularly seemly as a cardinal and somebody who wanted to portray peace in the world, and Wolsey worked tirelessly for peace. You know, was always trying to bring peace about. And so I don't think it would have been something that he would have done lightly. But he was also starting to fall apart at this point. So I don't think it would have been that out of character.
Yeah. All right. The next, I was thinking of what is it? You can take the boy out of the streets, but you can't take the streets out of the boy.
Yep.
So that it's coming back. So Legantine Court, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Okay. So this Legantine Court thing was crazy. Is this? I mean, I know you weren't there, but like is that how it went down? Like, I mean, all these people watching, and like the king making his case, and then some, you know, bishops like, my name's not on that, and then, I mean, I guess I'm not asking is every minute detail how it went, but just in general, was it just that kind of, I don't know, like spectacle and like kind of pandemonium, it seems like, especially after the queen gets up, like gets on her knees in front of the king and says what she says and then leaves. Like, it's just so, I mean, like, you couldn't write, like, if you're just going to write it crazy and dramatic, like, that's how you'd write it. So, I mean, can you tell me, like, anything about that?
It's pretty close to how it went down. Yeah. And in fact, I think they pretty much replicated the Queen's speech. I think they left a couple of things out. Her speech was actually longer. But yeah, it's pretty much how it went down. And she humiliated him. She just, it was a really bad scene. And she walked out and said she wasn't going to recognize the authority of it. And, they tried to call her back. Catherine the Queen, you have to come back. And she was like, I don't need to come back. I don't recognize this court. And, and the people saying, well, I didn't sign this. It was very close. Yes.
That's just pretty awesome. I think it's like my favorite scene so far. Just basically just saying this is a charade, and I just think it's pretty awesome. And it's almost a shame to know the outcome, because I wish the Queen would have gotten like a really good divorce settlement or something. But I guess not. So that was it. The last thing I wrote is that the Queen's a badass, because I think she's a badass. So I'm a big fan of Catherine of Aragon, and it makes me like Spain just a little bit more.
There you go.
So, that's it for me.
Well, cool. I think we're really kind of leading up to the season finale here, which is in 2 more episodes, which you can see the pace at which things are moving. So it will be exciting to kind of see how it all pans out. But yeah, I think this episode showed the weirdness at court. And also just, like we talked about, I think this kind of thing was very normal. If you were wealthy, you could get a divorce very easily. Normal people couldn't. But if you were a king, if you were a nobleman, if you had money to pay for it, it wasn't that big of a deal to get a divorce. And so Henry probably thought, like, no big deal. And was feeling very frustrated at this point. And, is so frustrated that he put his soul in eternal peril to break away finally. So it's interesting to see all of these forces coming together, like you said. So we will be back. Hopefully we'll try to do this again next week. Again, apologies about the sound. We're just kind of working with it here. But I'm going to try to do some editing and see what I can do here. If you like the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes. It is the number one thing you can do to help new shows out. And you can learn more about us at watchingthetudors.com. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you all. We'll see you next time, or talk to you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.